The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Wyoming plains, carrying with it a fury of snow that turned the world into a whirling white nightmare. Emma Thornton could no longer feel her feet. She stumbled forward through drifts that reached her knees, then her thighs, her thin coat doing nothing against the savage cold that had crept into her bones hours ago. Behind her, somewhere in that endless white void, lay the overturned stagecoach and the bodies of the driver and the other passenger. She had tried to help them, tried to pull the driver from beneath the wreckage, but his eyes had already grown distant and cold. The other passenger, an older woman who had shared her biscuits that morning, had simply closed her eyes in the snow and never opened them again. Emma had no choice but to walk. The driver had mentioned a ranch somewhere to the north before the axle broke and sent them careening off the trail. North. She thought she was going north, but in this storm, directions were meaningless. Everything was white and gray and merciless. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes. Each breath burned in her chest like swallowing hot coals, and her thoughts had begun to scatter like leaves in autumn wind. She thought of her sister in Denver, waiting for her arrival that would never come. She thought of her mother, dead these 5 years, and wondered if she would see her soon. She thought of the small bag she had left behind in the stagecoach, containing everything she owned in the world, and found she did not care anymore. Her foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow, and she fell forward, her hands plunging into the icy powder. She tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled uselessly. The snow felt almost warm now, and she knew what that meant. She had heard stories of people freezing to death, how at the end they felt warm and peaceful, how they simply lay down and went to sleep. It would be so easy to close her eyes, so easy to rest. She was so tired, so very tired. Her cheek pressed against the snow, and she felt herself beginning to drift, beginning to let go of the struggle that had defined the last several hours of her life. Then, through the screaming wind, she heard something. A dog barking. The sound was faint, almost imagined, but it pulled at something deep in her chest. Emma lifted her head, snow sliding from her hair, and squinted into the storm. There, barely visible through the swirling white curtain, was a dark shape, a building. She blinked hard, afraid it was a hallucination, but the shape remained. It was real. Salvation, or at least the hope of it, stood perhaps 50 yards away. She forced herself to her hands and knees, then to her feet. Every movement was agony. Every step was a battle against a body that no longer wished to obey. She fell twice more, and each time she had to dig deeper into reserves, of will she did not know she possessed. The building grew larger, resolving into a sturdy ranch house with smoke rising from its chimney. A dog's silhouette appeared on the porch, barking frantically. Emma reached the steps and collapsed against them. She tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. She crawled up one step, then another, her vision narrowing to a tunnel. She reached the door and raised her hand, managing one weak knock before her strength finally failed completely. She slumped against the rough wooden planks, consciousness slipping away like water through her fingers. The door opened and warm light spilled out across her. She heard a man's voice, sharp with surprise, calling out something she could not understand. Strong hands lifted her, and then there was warmth, blessed warmth, and the crackling of a fire, and darkness. When Emma opened her eyes, she thought perhaps she had died after all and gone somewhere unexpected. She was lying in a bed, buried beneath heavy quilts, in a room lit by the soft glow of an oil lamp. Her body ached everywhere, a deep throbbing pain that was somehow comforting because it meant she was alive. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as dizziness washed over her. A door opened and a man entered carrying a steaming cup. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples, and a weathered face that spoke of years spent under the sun and wind. His eyes were a striking pale blue, and they widened when he saw she was awake. "Easy now," he said, his voice deep and gentle. "Don't try to move too quick. You've been out for near 2 days." He set the cup on a small table beside the bed and helped her sit up, adjusting pillows behind her back with surprising care for such large hands. Name's John Cartwright. This is my ranch. My dog Duke found you on my porch during that devil of a storm. Thought you were dead at first. Emma's throat was painfully dry. When she tried to speak, only a croak emerged. John immediately offered her the cup, helping her hold it while she sipped. It was broth, rich and warm, and it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. After a few careful swallows, she found her voice. Emma Thornton, she managed. The stagecoach. There was an accident. The others, they didn't make it. I walked. I don't know how long. John's expression grew solemn. I'm sorry about your companions. Soon as this storm broke, I sent word to town. They'll send men to look for the wreckage and bring them back proper. You're lucky to be alive, Miss Thornton. Another hour in that cold and you wouldn't have been. Emma looked down at her hands, bandaged in clean white cloth. My fingers. Frostbite, but not too bad. You'll keep them all, though some might be tender for a while. Your toes are in better shape. You must have had good boots. His mouth quirked in something not quite a smile. You're a fighter. That's clear enough. Over the following days, Emma learned that John Cartwright was a widower who ran his ranch largely alone, with the help of a ranch hand named Miguel, who lived in a cabin on the far side of the property. John's wife had died in childbirth 7 years earlier, along with their infant daughter. He had thrown himself into work after that, building his ranch into one of the most successful in the territory. But the house remained painfully quiet and empty. He cooked his own meals, mended his own clothes, and spoke more to his dog and horses than to people. Emma recovered slowly, her strength returning by degrees. John insisted she stay until she was fully healed, and she had little choice but to accept. She had no money, no possessions beyond the clothes she had been wearing, which John had washed and mended. The winter had settled in hard, making travel impossible regardless. She found herself in a strange limbo, dependent on the kindness of this quiet, careful man who watched her with those pale eyes, as though trying to solve some puzzle. To earn her keep, Emma began helping around the house as soon as she could walk without dizziness. She cooked meals that John ate with obvious appreciation, having subsisted on his own rough bachelor fare for years. She cleaned and organized, mended clothes with skill learned from her mother, and slowly brought warmth and order to rooms that had known only functional emptiness. John protested at first, insisting she was his guest, but she was firm. She could not simply take without giving something in return. Her pride would not allow it. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, John spoke more than usual. You said you were heading to Denver. Family there. Emma stared into her coffee cup. My sister. She married a shopkeeper there 2 years ago. After our father passed last spring, there was nothing left for me in Kansas. The farm went to pay his debts. Catherine wrote and said I could come stay with them, help in the shop. She paused, struggling with the words. I don't know how to tell her I'm alive. We had agreed I would write when I arrived. She'll have heard about the stagecoach by now. She'll think I'm dead. I'll take you into town tomorrow if the weather holds, John said. You can send a telegram. Let her know you're safe. I have no money for a telegram. I have no money at all. John waved a hand dismissively. I'll cover it. You can pay me back someday if it matters to you. Emma felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. Why are you being so kind to me? You don't know me. I'm nothing to you. John was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful. When I found you on my porch, you reminded me that there's still things in this world worth saving. Worth fighting for. Maybe I'd forgotten that for a while. He looked at her then, something vulnerable in his expression. Besides, this house has been too quiet for too long. It's been nice, having someone to cook for, someone to talk to. The next day, true to his word, John hitched up his wagon, and they made the 10-mile journey to the small town of Clearwater. Emma sent her telegram to Catherine, explaining briefly what had happened and promising to write a proper letter soon. Catherine's reply came that same afternoon, frantic with relief and insisting Emma come to Denver immediately. There was money for the fare, sent through the Western Union office. Emma stood holding the telegram, staring at the promise of escape, of the new life she had been traveling toward before fate intervened. She should feel relieved, eager even, but instead, she felt a strange reluctance she could not quite name. "Good news?" John asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew. "My sister sent money for the train fare. I can leave as soon as the weather permits travel." John nodded slowly. "That's good. Real good." She must be worried sick. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the wagon creaking through the snow-packed road. The sky was a brilliant cold blue, and the sun sparkled on the endless white landscape. Emma found herself memorizing the view, the way the mountains rose in the distance, the way the wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. That night, Emma could not sleep. She lay in the guest room that had become familiar, listening to the wind and the settling of the house, and forced herself to face the truth she had been avoiding. She did not want to leave. Somewhere in these weeks of recovery, as she moved through the rhythms of this quiet house, as she shared meals and conversation with this careful, damaged man, something had shifted in her heart. She had begun to feel at home here in a way she had never felt anywhere else. The ranch, with its solitude and hard beauty, called to something deep in her nature. And John, with his gentle hands and wounded eyes, had awakened feelings she had thought herself too practical to entertain. But what claim did she have here? She was a charity case, a temporary guest. John had been kind, but kindness was not love. She was 26 years old, unmarried, with no prospects and no family beyond a sister who had her own life. The smart thing, the sensible thing, was to go to Denver as planned. To help Catherine in the shop, to make herself useful, to perhaps eventually find some measure of security in that growing city. The thought filled her with a gray despair that took her by surprise. Emma rose and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, then quietly made her way to the kitchen. She was surprised to find lamplight already glowing there. John sat at the table, a cup of coffee before him, staring at nothing. He looked up when she entered, and she saw her own sleeplessness reflected in his face. "Can't settle either?" he asked. Emma shook her head and poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove, then sat across from him. The silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable. Finally, John spoke, his words coming slowly, as though drawn from some place deep. "After Mary died, I thought I was done. With everything. I kept the ranch going because it was something to do, something to fill the hours, but I was just going through motions. I wasn't really living anymore, just existing. And I told myself that was enough, that maybe that was all I deserved." He turned the cup in his hands, not looking at her. "These past weeks, having you here, it's reminded me what it feels like to be alive. Really alive, not just breathing. The house feels warm again. Meals taste better. Even the work doesn't seem so heavy." Emma's heart was beating so hard she thought he must surely hear it. "John." He finally looked up, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I know you've got plans. I know you're meant for Denver and your sister's shop and a life that makes sense. I know I'm just some rancher who gave you shelter in a storm. But I have to ask, because if I don't, I'll regret it the rest of my days." He took a deep breath. "Stay. Not as a guest, not as someone paying off a debt. Stay as my wife. If you'll have me. Help me turn this ranch into a home again. Let me spend the rest of my life, making sure you never regret choosing this place, choosing me." Emma stared at him, the words she had not let herself hope for hanging in the air between them. 1,000 objections rose in her mind. They barely knew each other. This was too fast, too sudden. What would people say? What would Catherine think? But beneath all those sensible concerns was a truth more fundamental and undeniable. "I don't want to go to Denver," she said quietly. "I realized that days ago, but I was afraid to admit it. I don't want to be someone's charity case or spinster sister helping in a shop. I want this. The ranch, the mountains, the quiet. I want to build something real. I want." She met his eyes steadily. "I want you." John reached across the table and took her bandaged hand gently in his calloused one. "Then stay. Stay and make a life with me. It won't always be easy. Ranching never is. We'll have hard winters and dry summers and struggles I can't even predict yet. But we'll face them together. And I swear to you, Emma Thornton, I will do everything in my power to make you happy." Emma felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were tears of relief, of joy, of a future suddenly opening before her that was more than she had dared to imagine. Yes, I'll stay. I'll marry you." John stood and came around the table, pulling her up into his arms. He held her carefully, as though she were something precious and fragile, and she felt the tremor in his shoulders that said he was not as composed as he appeared. When he pulled back to look at her face, his eyes were bright with emotion. "I don't have much to offer," he said. "Just a ranch and a stubborn heart and a future that's uncertain, but it's yours if you want it." Emma reached up and touched his weathered face, feeling the scratch of stubble against her palm. "That's more than enough. More than I ever dreamed of." They were married in Clearwater 3 weeks later, in a simple ceremony attended by the town's minister, Miguel and his wife Rosa, and a handful of townspeople who had heard the romantic tale of the woman rescued from the storm. Emma wore a dress Rosa helped her sew, simple but beautiful, and carried wildflowers Miguel's children had somehow found growing in a sheltered spot. John wore his Sunday suit and looked more nervous than Emma had ever seen him, stumbling over his vows in a way that made her love him even more. Catherine's reply to Emma's letter explaining her decision had been mixed, concerned but ultimately supportive. She worried that Emma was rushing into things, acting out of gratitude rather than love, but she also wrote that she wanted her sister's happiness above all else. She promised to visit come spring, to meet this rancher who had captured Emma's heart so completely. The first months of marriage were an adjustment for them both. Emma had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and hard work, the constant attention required by animals and land. John had to relearn how to share his space in his life, to communicate and compromise, and consider another person in his decisions. They argued sometimes, usually over small things, learning each other's boundaries and tender spots. But beneath the adjustments and challenges was a foundation of genuine affection and growing love that made everything else manageable. Emma discovered she had a gift for the ranch work that surprised them both. She took to helping with the horses, learning to gentle and train them with a patience and intuition that John praised. She expanded the kitchen garden, planning for vegetables and herbs that would help them through the next winter. She learned to can and preserve, to render fat for soap, to do the 1,000 tasks required to keep a frontier household running. Her hands, once soft and suited only for needlework and light household tasks, became strong and capable. But more than the work, Emma found joy in the simple rhythms of their life together. Mornings when they drank coffee and watched the sun rise over the mountains. Evenings by the fire, reading or talking or simply sitting in comfortable silence. Nights when John held her close and whispered that finding her had been the greatest blessing of his life. Spring came with a rush of green and the bawling of new calves. Emma threw herself into the work, helping with the branding and the fence mending and the 100 tasks that came with the season. Miguel's wife Rosa became a good friend, teaching Emma the tricks and skills of frontier life, sharing recipes and gossip, and the companionship Emma had not realized she craved. One evening in late April, as Emma and John sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky impossible shades of gold and pink, Emma felt a contentment so complete it almost frightened her. She thought of that desperate woman stumbling through the storm, certain she was going to die. She thought of the life she had been heading toward in Denver, respectable and safe and ultimately hollow. She thought of the twist of fate that had brought her here instead. To this ranch and this man, and this life she loved with a fierceness that still surprised her. "What are you thinking about?" John asked, slipping his arm around her shoulders. Emma leaned into him, feeling the solid strength of his body, breathing in the scent of him that had become home. "I was thinking about that storm, about how I was so sure I was dying, how everything I thought I knew about my life ended that day. Regret." John's voice was carefully neutral, but she heard the concern beneath it. Emma turned to look at him, reaching up to touch his face. Never, not for 1 second. That storm brought me to you. Gave me this life. Sometimes I think it was all meant to be exactly the way it happened. Every terrible moment of it led me here, to this porch, to you. I'd walk through that storm 100 times, if I knew this was waiting at the end of it. John pulled her close and kissed her forehead, and she felt him relax against her. I love you, Emma Cartwright. More than I thought I could ever love anything again. I love you too. More than words can say. They sat together as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, and Emma thought about how strange and wonderful life could be. How sometimes the worst moments led to the greatest blessings. How being lost could be the first step to being found. How dying in a snowstorm could be reborn as living in the sunshine. Inside the house, the lamp glowed warm and welcoming. Smoke rose from the chimney into the clear evening air. In the distance, cattle lowed softly and horses whickered in the barn. The ranch was alive and thriving, and so was Emma's heart. She had set out for Denver seeking security and a place to belong. Instead, fate and a Wyoming blizzard had brought her to something far better, a home built on love, a partnership forged in survival, and a future bright with possibility. She thought of the woman she had been, stumbling through the snow toward an unknown door, driven by nothing but the desperate will to survive. That woman had been brave without knowing it, strong without realizing it. She had walked through death itself to find life on the other side. Emma smiled and nestled closer to John, feeling his arms tighten around her. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and pine, and she breathed it in deeply. This was her place. This was her home. This was the life she had been meant for all along. Even when she was walking a different path. Sometimes the greatest gift came wrapped in the most terrible circumstances. Sometimes you had to lose everything to find what you were truly meant to have. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent and eternal, witnesses to one small human story of survival and love and unexpected grace. In the morning, there would be work to do, challenges to face, the endless demands of ranch life. But tonight, there was only this two people who had found each other against impossible odds, sitting together as darkness fell, grateful for the storms that had shaped them and the peace they had found in their aftermath. Emma closed her eyes and let herself simply feel the moment, storing it away like a treasure. When she was old, she would remember this evening, this feeling, this perfect sense of rightness. She would remember that once, barely alive in a snowstorm, she had reached a door that changed everything. She would remember that fate, for all its cruelty, could also be kind. She would remember that sometimes the worst thing that could happen opened the door to the best thing that ever would. The wind sang through the pines, carrying stories of other lives, other struggles, other moments of grace. But Emma's story was her own, written in survival and second chances. In the courage to keep walking when death seemed certain, in the bravery to choose love over safety, to embrace an unknown future over a predictable one. She had come through the storm. She had survived. And in surviving, she had found not just life, but a reason to live it fully and joyfully, and without regret. That was more than enough. That was everything. That was the new beginning she had been given when she fell against John Cartwright's door, more dead than alive, not knowing that she was knocking on the entrance to her future, her home, her heart. The night deepened around them, soft and full of stars, and Emma held tight to her husband's hand and smiled at the beautiful mystery of it all.